Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, where we invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. I'm John Plotz of Brandeis, and today I am truly delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Lara Jockusch, to speak to us about her most recent book, Jewish Revenge and the Holocaust, History, Memory, and Imagination. So, Lara, it's a joy to have you on the show, so welcome.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me tell you a little bit about Lara's previous work first. So, Collect and Record, Jewish Holocaust Documentation in Early Post-War Europe, which was published in 2012, is the first comparative history of a number of documentation centers and historical commissions that pioneered Holocaust research in the wake of the Second World War. And she's also published a lot since then, including a book that is, I think, very relevant to today's discussion. Back in 2014, Lara, Jewish Honor Courts, Revenge, Retribution, and Reconciliation in Europe and Israel After the Holocaust. I will not go at great length, but I will say beyond all that work, Lara is a consummate polyglot scholar interested in the agential categories of many eras and many peoples. And I think that's a crucial element in the topics we explore today, which are what it means to take revenge, to exact vengeance, to seek redress, to go vigilante in seeking justice, what counts as the proper or sufficient retaliation or retribution. And you'll notice I'm using a lot of words here, which are so close to one another, and yet in the wake of a disaster or an unaddressed crime, they're subtly distinct. The brilliance of Lara's work is how she pulls apart those distinctions. So just to say a little bit more, the question arises of how people after a great tragedy or a great disaster or an atrocity, how are people made right? What is doing right? What is overdoing? What can be left to the courts? And Lara has written a marvelous book about the reckonings that come after World War II and out of the Holocaust. So, Lara, we generally start here by inviting our author to lay out the central claims in your own words. Talk about its key evidentiary basis, its intervention, and perhaps what you hope its impact may be. So, over to you.
Thank you. Maybe I start by saying how I got to the topic. So First of all, I was really struck by how much interest there currently is in pop culture. Basically, since Tarantino's *Inglourious Basterds* in 2009.
I watched it this morning, by the way. That was my homework.
That's quite a lot to watch in the morning.
It was. It spoiled my breakfast a little bit, yeah.
I can imagine, yes, your appetite. So this kind of counterfactual obsession with this Holocaust survivor, avenger figure, or in the case of Quentin Tarantino, it's not survivors really. It's also set during the war, but this counterfactual history of powerful Jews who come for Nazis and reverse the injustice of the Holocaust. And so that's the popular culture interest, and we have lots of examples from, for example, Prime, Amazon Prime, The Hunters, or Netflix, The Defeated, or Jaguar. And so what is it that people are so interested in these counterfactual narratives? And at the same time, we have prominent survivors such as Elie Wiesel or Simon Wiesenthal, or not well-known survivors who give testimonies in the 1980s and 1990s, who said basically that revenge didn't matter and that Jews did not take revenge. All they wanted was justice. And that was really striking to me, because when you look at early post-war sources or writings, literary and autobiographic writings, for example, of Elie Wiesel himself, you can see that there was actually lots of talking and thinking about revenge. There was lots of emotional indulgence of vengeful feelings and revenge fantasies. And you can also see that, for example, in sources from the wartime, in letters, in diaries, in wall inscriptions, which talk about revenge fantasies or revenge imperatives for the future. Whoever will survive should take revenge. What are we to make of this contradiction that in the 1980s and 90s we have these prominent survivors who have gained public recognition as moral authority figures who say revenge didn't matter, and then we have these sources, sometimes by the same people from a couple of decades back, which actually show the opposite, namely that revenge did matter to individuals. And so what's the story behind it? That's what I was trying to find out.
We're going to get into the tricky bits of the temporality, I think, but that example, because that question of avenge me, that formulation for I am presently suffering this wrong, will you who come after avenge me? It feels like there's a lot of subtle questions that relate to the time at which one either rebels or takes revenge. Like, for example, just to speak of the Quentin Tarantino example, if you're doing it during World War II, it's an act of rebellion or resistance, right?
We have a lot of examples of Jews who took violent revenge on Nazi perpetrators, but compared to the evidence that we have of how Jews thought and wrote about revenge, the revenge acts are actually in the minority. And that had to do with powerlessness and also with the fact that Nazi perpetrators did actually retaliate against Jews in very brutal and gruesome forms. So that really was disincentivizing to act out revenge impulses. And so we have lots of testimony where survivors actually say that I wanted revenge. I had revenge fantasies, thinking of my murdered parents or my dearest, but I knew that it was selfish to act out these fantasies because it would have endangered other prisoners or other Jews around me. And so there is this, in a way, this contradiction between the personal urges versus the collective responsibility that people felt that actually led people not to take revenge, but to think about revenge as a fantasy. And so what you were saying, like, where's in a way the difference between a revenge act or act of self-defense versus an act of revenge, I think it's very fluid in the event itself. It's very fluid. So I give you an example. I think there is a difference. I think there's a difference, for example, people who took revenge, say, in ghetto uprisings or even in concentration camp uprisings or death camp uprisings, they did so because they hoped that they would be able to escape. For example, in October 1943 in Sobibor, there's this idea that even if I as an individual will die in this act, it will, however, change the power relations in favor of the victims so that the perpetrator's plot to murder us all is not going to happen or to succeed. And so there is this moment of optimism. Even if it costs our life, we can do something that will change the power relations. Whereas revenge comes from a much more pessimistic and powerless moment, I think, where it's often a last resort coping mechanism. For example, of people who realized that they were going to be murdered and they could not escape that situation. They were in the antechamber of the gas chambers at Treblinka or at Auschwitz, and they were realizing they have no way of getting out of this. But what they could do was to yell revenge slurs at the SS guards standing there or spitting in their faces. And so we have lots of evidence where, for example, women who were walking to their deaths were actually yelling and revenge slurs at the perpetrators. Today you can murder us, but you will lose this war. You will see that tomorrow we will come for you. And it's really interesting because it's also a counterfactual, obviously a counterfactual account of power. In a way, it is reversing the power relationship in the very moment by very much playing on anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish power to, in a way, manipulate the perpetrators in the very moment that they can feel powerful, but they are in fact powerless. And the victims are much more powerful than the perpetrators.
There's two aspects of this, which are, I think, part of the unfolding of the book. One is that you make an interesting set of claims about a kind of fantasized revenge as also working. There's a sort of distinction between the actual deeds, which your point is that there's many fewer than you might expect to see of deeds that are like historically recorded, but then there's imaginative fantasy. And I would imagine one of the reasons for you choosing to turn to Quentin Tarantino at the end is that you're interested in thinking about the acting out of the imaginative fantasy. So a sort of naive historical question might be, is fantasized revenge even revenge at all? In other words, just fantasizing it or just sublimating it into feeling, how do you equate that or analyze it alongside the acts? And that's point one. But then the point two that you got to right at the end is this notion that you're also tapping into anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews as especially vindictive or vengeful, a German belief, or maybe a more common Christian belief of Jews as vengeance seeking. How much of this is specific to the association of Jews stereotypically as being those people who seek vengeance?
Yes. So the first point, of course, we cannot broaden the category of what is revenge so that it basically can be anything. That would be meaningless. But I think it's really important to say that we tend to focus in our understanding of what revenge is, to focus on violence and violent acts. And I think we need to broaden that and to have a broader understanding of different revenge phenomena which have the same emotional benefit to someone who suffers oppression and seeks to rise beyond the state of oppression by reversing the power relations between victim and perpetrator.
Laura, can I just add a claim you make in the book? Forgive me, this is not an exact quote, but I think it's close, is that revenge and justice are often seen as antithetical, but you actually see them as linked to one another. So structurally, we've put them as polarities, but you're arguing for understanding that polarity somewhat differently.
So the question of how to include fantasies or non-violent acts as revenge, I think is really important. Because if we look at what revenge does for the people who use it, there's little difference between the satisfaction that one can get from a revenge act and the satisfaction that one can get from imagining the act and from, I don't know, writing a poem about it. Because I think the emotional engagement is similar. And I would even go so far and say it is even better to engage in the fantasy, because then you don't have the messiness and the morally compromising part of having to do revenge, so to speak. Survivors talked about this a lot, about wanting to engage in the revenge fantasy and having some benefit from it, but not wanting to actually become violent or be engaged in the bloody craft of revenge. You don't need to become violent, and you can still satisfy some of these emotional urges that one might have in a particular situation.
So as a humanities person, as someone who likes art and the notion of aesthetic sublimation, of course I find that attractive. But from a historian's perspective, if you think about lex talionis as like an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, does that even meet the substantive definition of revenge or retribution then, if you don't if it doesn't have any real world cost?
I would say yes. It really depends on how you define revenge, right? But I would make a claim that we can extend it to include also fantasies that were never enacted. Of course, criminally speaking, it's a totally different game, right? Or morally speaking, it's a different game. But in terms of what the function of the idea of revenge is, I think we can actually include it. And I think as a historian, I think it's really interesting to see that people would use so much of their energies in a given moment to think about how they can strike back at the people who hurt them. And even if it doesn't actually yield any acts, it still is represented in diaries, in letters, as a theme. And so that's what, or as a theme of conversation, or even in art, in caricature, in jokes. So that makes it real for the people who actually used it. And so that's why as a historian would, of society and culture, want to give this some room in the discussion of the topic. Of course, it has a different weight than a revenge act that has a criminal result. But I think trying to understand a moment in time, and also how the thinking and talking about revenge evolves over time, I can look at these symbolic forms as well.
Can we pursue this thought a little bit along the lines of your connection to justice and revenge? I'm very interested in abolitionist thinking and the problem of prison and carceral reform. Mm-hmm. And so in justice, like the justice of the Nuremberg trials, the justice against any act of violence that needs to be seen, that the society as a whole needs to take a stance on. Normally, we assume that justice has to have consequences as well. But the model you're setting up, if the revenge can be enacted symbolically in the ways you're describing, can justice also be enacted symbolically in the same ways?
When we think about the post-war period, we often think of the good lessons of having created a justice system that holds heads of states accountable for their domestic crimes as well as their international crimes. And so this is the dominant perception of, in a way, the lessons of World War II and the Holocaust. But I think I would just want to complicate this a little bit because, yes, it's true that we ended up with a lot of courtroom justice, but that doesn't mean that the path to the courtroom wasn't also accompanied by a lot of extra legal, vengeful actions, not just by liberated prisoners, not just by liberated Jews, but also by Allied soldiers, for example, expulsions of Germans, purges, massive sexual violence against German and Austrian women. So that's something we tend to forget, but it was in a way accompanying this process towards courtroom justice, right? And so I think we need to put these two together. But for individual Jews who survived the Holocaust, there is this element of seeking a form of redress, and whether this goes through the courtroom or whether this comes through in a different way is also linked, because someone could say, and lots of survivor testimonies who make this case, that basically they realize that violent revenge is pointless. It's not going to bring back the dead, alleviate their pain. But ultimately, having survived becomes a symbolic form of revenge for them, very personally. And having survived and being able to give evidence against a perpetrator so that this can be used in court, they refer to it as a personal form of revenge. And that doesn't mean that their testimony is tainted or that it's made up or less reliable, as a lot of German voices at the time would, of course, claim in a self-serving way. Not at all. It is, the testimony can be absolutely reliable and truthful, and yet the individual can say, the fact that I lived through this moment to counter the mendacious claims of this perpetrator on the stand is my personal revenge. But that's why I think it's linked.
Yeah. So you talk about, there's so many different cases you talk about. I love that you began by talking about the shift in Wiesel's own writing. Can you say more about the line from Wiesel that really stuck with me, is the notion of the need to sublimate the mandate for revenge, or just seek consolation, not retribution. So can you just say a little bit more about the timeline you're seeing? You're saying that during the immediately post-war period, there's a more strong articulation of revenge and retribution. And then the language shifts in a later period. And then I think I also hear you say it shifts again in a different, yeah. So can you talk more about what's your historian's account of that change over time?
Yes, it's really interesting. So I think Jews got into revenge gradually because revenge was a taboo. It was something that law-abiding citizens would not do. It had, of course, the stigma that this narrative of modernity, that we overcome vengeful impulses by having a justice system in place. But then what European Jews experience is, of course, that laws are transformed into instruments of oppression and genocide, and that the states that were their states were destroyed, and there's nowhere to talk to turn to in terms of legal institutions for them, and that on the contrary they are victimized through laws. And so it's really interesting that we have these examples of these two outliers, David Frankfurter and Herschel Grünspan, who David Frankfurter in February 1936 murders this Nazi party representative in Switzerland, Wilhelm Gustloff in Davos, and Herschel Greenspan, we know, murdered this or shot and this embassy employee Ernst von Rath in Paris. And they both actually did commit this kind of outrageous, violent act because they wanted to call attention to the injustices that Jews were facing at the hands of Nazi Germany. And so they were outliers. Jews at the time thought that this was really the wrong way to advocate for Jewish rights. Of course, they were totally looked upon as madmen who really had no case here. And so actually it takes until late in 1943 when especially younger Jews turn to the idea of revenge or to engage the idea. It doesn't mean that they take revenge, but to talk about revenge as an imperative for whoever will survive. And so there's lots of material transmitted by Sonderkommandos in death camps about people's paths to gas chambers and what they shouted at guards. And there's letters and inscriptions that call for revenge. During the war, people say that they almost have no purpose in life or any energy to go on living. But this idea that the Germans will be defeated and there's going to be revenge at the end and they want to live and see this moment gives them the strength to carry on into the most inhumane and impossible conditions. And so we have this rise in talk about revenge or thinking about revenge towards the end of the war. But then once the war is over, we don't see this big revenge in a way that people imagined. We have this example of Aberkoffen and this group Nakam that has this idea of murdering 6 million Germans through poisoning the water system of a couple of major German cities, or the plan to poison bread to murder German POWs through poisoned bread. But these plans, they are basically pipe dreams. They don't manifest. This plan to poison the bread ends up in basically upset stomachs of a couple of hundred POWs outside of Nuremberg. But it's more a fantasy than a real plan. And I think it's fascinating that, in a way, we could expect to see much more revenge, which doesn't come. And so the question in terms of the periodization, then what happens after the war? Why does the big revenge in a way not come? Even for the people who say they had urges during the war and helped them survive, we let go of revenge. And that has to do, I think, with the frailness of survivors. It has to do with the statute of limitations, so to speak, that in this transition from war to peace, it's still legitimate. There's a lot of violence, there's an impunity, but it only lasts a couple of days, perhaps weeks. And once the peacetime, in a way, consolidates itself, it also has a different moral regime. Survivors then said, it became clear to me that I actually cannot take revenge. Yeah. It's not appropriate, and I don't want to do it.
You were describing the acts of the early pre-war acts of, the phrase I want to use is violent disobedience, because I want to trigger the notion that there's a tradition going back to maybe Thoreau or maybe Tolstoy or maybe Gandhi, which is the civil disobedience. And I think we understand civil disobedience, which is civil disobedience is you're in a system that is in some part unjustly governed, and you can respond to it in a nonviolent way, just as people tried civil disobedience and pacific disobedience in America in the civil rights era. But of course, during the Civil War, the sense was actually we need some kind of violent action because slavery is such an unlawful thing that what we need is to be willing to kill people in order to end it. So you're describing a situation in which violent disobedience is sanctioned. And so here comes the present part. People are talking now about a changed political habitus in the United States and in Europe, and maybe people are exaggerating. But it certainly seems true that both on the right and the left, people are more willing to engage in violent acts than they used to be. And I'm wondering how we should think about that in the context of somebody like Donald Trump saying, I am your retribution. In other words, I represent an articulation of the breakdown of the system. The system should have worked for us. The moral regime, you are describing the restoration of moral order after World War II, and I take that point. But, there are times when people think there is no moral order, or the moral order isn't working, or the state isn't working. Those are times when it seems like revenge, maybe it's not justified. Maybe what people say, it doesn't even need to be justified, but it's just inevitable because you don't have anywhere else to turn.
Yeah, and it is, of course, very dangerous because I think that brings all the stigmata that revenge has in terms of being cyclical, being uncontrollable, because it can become more and more extreme.
Oh, yeah, that's what the Oresteia is about, right? Isn't that what Aeschylus is saying? He's saying, yeah, you could get vengeance, but if you get vengeance, then you'll just have an inevitable cycle of people taking vengeance.
Absolutely. And so I think writing about revenge during the Holocaust and basically making the claim that it did actually matter as a coping response for the victims doesn't mean that I endorse revenge definitely as a timeless human phenomenon, but it doesn't mean that I'm advocating for it. On the contrary, I think this story actually shows that while it can be, the Holocaust was, of course, a very extreme situation, that it can have a certain function to cope. But at the same time, the idea that many survivors and even non-survivors Jews during the Holocaust already expressed was that we need to also be careful and put limits to it, because our humanity might be better served if we actually don't act out revenge, because it actually, in a way, I think the internal discourse that individuals have about revenge, what does revenge do to us if we act it out, if we don't control it, even if we are justified to feel the urge, don't act it out, it does something to our kind of human condition. And I think it's very insightful that a lot of survivors talked about the moral ambiguity of revenge. While it's justified and perhaps just, doesn't mean we need to do it. On the contrary, if we don't do it, we actually we can reconnect to our human values and our humanity in a much more productive way than when we act it out and we would become just the perpetrator. I think moral discourse really fascinating.
Yeah, that is totally fascinating. And honestly, Laura, if we had infinite time, I would want to talk about the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem here, where Arendt kind of goes through the justifications for executing or not executing on those grounds. But I wanted to connect this back also, since you are this is a topic I don't know, but I want to hear more from you. You're such an expert on the history of anti-Semitism, not just of the Nazi era, but a longer history of European anti-Semitism. And you make some claims that were striking to me and not what I was expecting in the argument of the book, about a longer set of associations of Jews as revenge seekers. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that particular set of stereotypes or assumptions?
Absolutely. So I think part of the reason why this topic has not been touched by historians for a long time, and I also grappled with addressing it, is that the idea that Jews are particularly vengeful or more vengeful than other human beings is a long anti-Semitic stereotype, specifically a Christian idea. And so for me as a historian, the question was, how can we address the historical validity of the topic and how people talk about it, and in a way analyze the functions that revenge had for victims, but also for perpetrators and, for lack of a better term, bystanders, people who were not directly involved in the mass murder, but nevertheless were part of the historical moment. And so how can I do that? And so I think it can only work if we acknowledge the longer history of anti-Semitism and also analyze, in a way, how the Nazi perpetrators used the stereotype of Jewish vengeance. And so that's why there's a whole chapter about how Nazi propagandists used the stereotypes of Jewish revenge and how, in a way, they racialized revenge as something Jewish. At the same time, they also say, we, the Germans, need to take revenge on the Jews for the long history, their alleged long history of Jewish wrongs against the German nation, etc. but it also is used as a category to mobilize perpetrators. So, for example, there are these pseudo ethical rationalizations that then individual perpetrators in the killing fields have. Why did you even shoot Jewish children? They can't be blamed for partisan fight. They can't be. And then the perpetrators made these pseudo-ethical rationalizations. They would take revenge on our children or our grandchildren. That's why we needed to complete the genocide.
I think about Elaine Scarry's work on the body and pain, where you always have to generate, in order to commit an act of violence against someone else, you have to generate this sense of grievance, and the grievance can be projected into the future. Imagine how they would treat us in the future were they to survive this, given what we plan to do to them. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think here it connects also the Nazi regime to authoritarian movements more broadly. A lot of revenge and vengeance rhetoric, especially on the extreme right, but not only on the extreme right, especially on the extreme right, has to do with imagined grievances and with kind of a rhetoric of let's take revenge on all our enemies. And that is an endless list of enemies that can then be, quote unquote, rightfully be violated. So it can also be used as an excuse to perpetrate violence against political enemies, right? By the whole idea of revenge. And I think that's exactly what the Nazis were doing. It was yet another way to mobilize Germans into victimizing Jews.
I'm sure you have not read this new book, Atrocity, A Literary History by Bruce Robbins. I just picked it up yesterday, so forgive me, this is a little fresh, but he has this definition of atrocity. There is no mystery as to why the accusatory label atrocity has been resisted by those whose collectivity stands accused. But there is some mystery swirling around the historical fact that in certain times and places, it has become possible for people of country X to accuse themselves of committing an atrocity. How could something so seemingly unlikely have come to pass? So his examples are the U.S. bombing of civilians at the end of World War II. So in other words, moments at which people actually turned that accusatory eye on themselves. And obviously that's so different from what you're talking about, because you are talking about the imagined retribution, revenge, like retaliation for the wrong. And I guess my question is, how do we think those two things together? Because both of those seem to occur, like coming to terms with Vietnam, like coming to terms with what the U.S. had done. And I believe in Germany, there's a similar, people talk about those 20 years after World War II as a historical reckoning. So how do we think about that coexisting with the era of revenge?
Yeah. So I think when we look at the German chapter in this, I think it's interesting how the revenge motifs are also used in a way. So they are used to excuse participation in genocidal acts because of exactly what you just said. It's basically the prophylactic or the preemptive foiling of what they would do to us logic and of reversing victim and aggressor. But it's also towards the end of the war, in the early post-war period, we have this self-critical investigation as well, that the Jews have all the reasons to take revenge on us because of what we did to them. So it is actually then reversed, that it is not an excuse to perpetrate a genocide, but it is because we perpetrated a genocide, of course they must be vengeful against us. And so I think that's something that in a way lingers even today with a lot of Germans, that of course they must hate us. Of course they must seek revenge after what we did to them. And so I find it really interesting that that revenge motifs could endure this complete sea change in terms of Germans taking responsibility or denying responsibility and then taking responsibility. They could still think revenge as a constant in this. And they could also still, in doing that, espouse anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as vengeful in this and without even noticing it. That's fascinating to me. I don't know if that answers your question.
That is a very good answer about how one element gets mixed in. But I guess the word I was looking for, by the way, apropos of Vietnam, was soul searching. So the notion that you are looking, what is it? I'm sure this happened after World War II to some extent, but it clearly happened after Vietnam. People like Howard Zinn, who wrote The People's History of the United States, he himself was like, he dropped napalm during the World War II. He was a napalm bomber. So the act of soul searching is like, how did we become the people who could do this? And yeah, I just feel like that's a dimension of how we think about atrocities that we have to reckon with alongside this, which is...
We do.
Yeah.
And you know what? I think that my generation, so the grandchildren generation, I think we do have a lot of empathy. I'm speaking now for Germans who were born in the 70s or 80s, who have actually an interest in this story, because I think they can empathize with kind of the emotional urge of revenge, with this frustration that when we look at the history of trials, yes, trials were important, but when you look in the bigger picture with the millions of people who were involved in these atrocities, it only is a tiny percentage of people who ever got held accountable for it. And so I think there is a certain, perhaps also soul searching among the descendants. How could our country, our culture, our grandparents get to this point? And there is also an empathizing with revenge as a feeling that is legitimate to have. It doesn't mean that you need to become an avenger and act it out, but as an emotional response to the atrocities themselves, we can empathize with revenge, I think. And so for the survivors who did engage in revenge and maybe acted it out and maybe not, and had good reasons why they did not, I want to humanize them, because I think revenge as a response to atrocity is a deeply human response. And so we need to acknowledge the humanity of the victims. But there's a lot of moral judgment of survivors, though they are put on a pedestal. They're not supposed to have any quote unquote ugly feelings.
Yeah.
But it's very important to also acknowledge the ugly feelings, because it is a very complex experience.
And maybe, Laura, that leads me to the last set of questions here before we turn towards Recallable Books, which is about how you understand the generalizability of your work. Can you talk about how you think about this as a story of the particularities of the Holocaust, but also the lessons that pertain to genocide studies, to other instances where we would study moments of atrocity and response?
Yeah, I think that the generalizability is certainly that victims of genocide have a lot of different responses to their experiences, and that we need to acknowledge that revenge, whether it's a feeling or whether it is a revenge act, or whether it is in a way translated into symbolic realms, is a way of coping with that extreme form of victimization, loss, and destruction. I have not done the research, but I would like to have a broader conversation of the role of revenge as a coping response of victims in genocide broadly. And at the same time, I think revenge rhetoric used by genocide perpetrators, we also need to look at, especially this idea that there's this imaginary grievance that needs to be rectified and avenged, and how these imaginary grievances that may have a kernel of truth depending on the context are blown out of proportion because they're actually used to be an excuse to get people to sign on a genocidal project. And I think we also need to look for that in other genocides, certainly in the Rwandan genocide.
I was thinking about Rwanda. I was thinking about Armenian. I was also thinking, I know you and I have discussed this before, Laura, but I think we can talk about a Roma genocide during the Holocaust as well, and whether the case is comparable there. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think so. I would like the field to take this on. I would like to actually, and also how victims can become perpetrators and perpetrators can become victims. And that doesn't excuse a German who's victimized by a revenge act after the war, and who was a perpetrator before that. It's not a moral quid pro quo or like a zero-sum game. It doesn't make this perpetrator less a perpetrator if the perpetrator becomes victimized. It just shows how complex these transitions out of extreme violent moments are. In the case of the Holocaust, I think we this is a case in which we have lots of thinking about revenge, but very little revenge acts. That in and of itself is really interesting. And I think I tell the story of why the big revenge didn't happen. And there's lots of really interesting ethical discourse and soul searching and reckoning with survival that I think is very powerful.
And maybe final thought about that, which is just thinking of your very suggestive chronology of the period of the first generation post-Holocaust in which the language is of reconciliation and a nuanced moving away from revenge. I still feel like we need a retelling of the story of the rise of ethno-nationalism, the sort of authoritarian ethno-nationalism we currently have. And obviously, I understand and I admire people like Tony Judd, who told the story in which ethno-nationalism was waning post-World War II, perhaps as a result of World War II. So one question would be, do we understand ethno-nationalism as actually rebounding now in some ways as an after effect of World War II? Or do we see the new ethno-nationalism and its rise as, I don't know, a genuinely novel phenomenon? I don't know if you have an answer for that. If you have an answer for that, it would be great.
In a way, I think that the post-war period really comes to an end now with a generational end, that we don't have any contemporaries anymore.
Yeah.
And I think we might be in a really new phase, of course, inspired by that very difficult past by any means. But I find, so what strikes me at this situation is that we could know it better, that we have so much, we thought at least we had learned so much, and we had moved away from the violence, and by putting all these checks and balances into place, by having a justice system that's too slow, but still we do have all the achievements in place in terms of genocide convention, in terms of crimes against humanity, etc., International Criminal Court, and yet it does not actually prevent us from making the same mistakes.
Also, Laura, I imagine you're not going to accept this compliment as a German, but I will say the ethno-nationalism of Germany in the 20s, 30s, and 40s is clearly the great shame of the world and horrific and horrible. And Germany now is not a dangerous center of ethno-nationalism, and that must in part be a product of whatever reforms and educational change occurred. If you look at Hungary, you look at Poland, you look at other places in the area that are vulnerable. Russia is extremely vulnerable to a murderous form of ethno-nationalism. But Germany, I understand it's debatable because of AfD, but come on, not compared to what's happening in Hungary or Poland or Russia. So there must be an explanation there in terms of what happened during the post-war decades.
Well, I'm very concerned about the AfD, and that as a side comment. But I think we do have a tendency to focus too much on Germany in some ways, and to, as if kind of the rise of ethno-nationalism in Germany is in a way worse than elsewhere, and so that may make us totally insensitive to what is actually going on elsewhere. And I would agree with you that we shouldn't be doing that. We should actually look really carefully what is going on everywhere, and how revenge is actually used as an excuse to go after opponents, to shut down free speech, etc. So it's very pertinent, but I'm not optimistic about the AfD, really. I'm very concerned, but that's maybe a different conversation.
And I will say, in classic Prater Radio fashion, you and I have discussed how we would think about ethno-nationalism in the Middle East as well. Maybe we don't need to go there as well. But
that was also part of my difficulty, honestly, to writing this book, that of course there's a lot of revenge in the current conflict in the Middle East, and I wanted to make a clear cut that this book is about revenge in the context of the Holocaust, and that is the field that I can comfortably write about. I cannot write about the current conflict in the Middle East, although there's lots of revenge motifs. I cannot, or in the United States, right? You already said, I mean, Donald Trump is all about revenge.
I really take your point about the particular and your willingness to define your scope narrowly, but I think that's also what gives it generalizable force, right? I mean, you have to, that's the historian's art, is that you look locally and you try to tell a story that's consistent on the terms of the period you're studying. And then we have to step back and ask the questions of what's generalizable about this? What's recurrent? So, okay, with that in mind, can I turn to the final topic of every Recall This Book? If listeners have enjoyed this conversation, is there a book you might suggest to them as something they would want to turn to?
Oh, yes. So first of all, I would encourage people to look at wartime accounts of the Holocaust that do talk a lot about revenge. And what comes to mind is Salman Gradowski, The Last Consolation Vanished, which is Salman Gradowski was a Sonderkommando, member of the Sonderkommando, the prisoners who were kept alive, who had to handle the remains of the victims of the gas chambers. And he wrote secret notes, about his day-to-day, the impossibility of coping with this reality, in notes that he hid in a thermos bottle and that were found after the war. He didn't survive. And it is a very powerful account. It's not just about Auschwitz and the Sonderkommando, but it is also about the human condition. He has so much insight into love, into the human existence, even nature. He talks about how he experiences looking at the moon. And it is very moving. And it has also a lot of interventions that relate to revenge, which are really powerful. And another, I think, is fantastic book by Jean Amery, At the Mind's Limit, Contemplations by a Survivor on Auschwitz and Its Realities. And Jean Amery, as a survivor, has a lot of insight. There's one chapter that deals with resentment. So he talks about why revenge is not fruitful and why one has certain urges of revenge and acting out is pointless, and how justice is limited and also doesn't bring satisfaction, but it's still better than revenge. But he also has this chapter, which is very insightful, about resentments and how the resentments accompany, in a way, the afterlife of the experience of atrocity. And this is something that needs to be acknowledged as a component of basically the reality of survival. I have another one, which I really recommend highly. It's not so well known. That's why I want to give it a shout out.
Yeah.
Philipp Müller. Müller was also a Sonderkommando at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
He wrote a very interesting, moving, and in a way sober, it's very down to earth account of his 3 years at Auschwitz. It's called Eyewitness Auschwitz, 3 years in the gas chambers.
Well, as always, I'm left with this renewed respect for your work and also this thought of, oh my God, how could I do what you do?
I think that what kept me also going and engaging with these materials is that it actually shows that Jews were, of course, not passive at all, and that in this big spectrum of responses, we need to give revenge a place as well.
Yeah, I really take that point. That's helpful. Yeah.
And so I think there's a richness in it. There's an ingenuity. There's jokes, and there's a lot of life in these responses.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's great. So I've got almost nothing to add on the Recallable Books. I did just want to put another word in for Michael Kohlhaas, because I just think about that. I think about that story all the time. So it's a story of this man who ends up leading a rebellion against the whole of the Holy Roman Empire, basically based on a perceived slight with the way his horses are seized at a toll gate and not returned to him in proper condition. And in any case, Laura, thank you so much. This doesn't even begin to do justice to this wonderful book that, again, is Jewish Revenge and the Holocaust, History, Memory, and Imagination from Bloomsbury Press, which I highly recommend. And I look forward to having you back on for your next book. So on behalf of all of us listening, Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John.
And thank you all for listening. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Nawal Irfani, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you, our listeners, with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.